The next step would be designing an experiment. And before you do that, you have to do this. Identify the 5 basic parts of what you're going to need for an experiment. First, you're going to be independent variable, which we already did, would be in this case the deforestation level. Second is going to be your dependent variable, which is what you're going to be measuring, which is the amount of erosion. The control group is going to be a group that does not receive treatment. Treatment is what you're doing to the independent variable, so that's going to be changing the amount of deforestation. So the control group, you should not change the deforestation, you should leave the forest alone. The experimental groups is the groups that you're actually going to change the independent variable. That means you're going to cut some trees down. But you could have more than one. You could have one you cut half the trees of the forest off, another one you cut 75%, another 25%, and those are the levels of the independent variable that you have to describe and talk about on your background. Then you also have to talk about the constants. What are other things that could affect the dependent variable that I have to maintain constant? Once you've written that down on a piece of paper and you have all of these 5 things identified, it will be a lot easier to actually create your experiment. And you have to do the following things in the following step. First, think about a way of changing your independent variable. You should have researched that for your background already, but think about how you're actually going to do it on your experiment. I can say, for example, I'm going to separate, I'm going to create habitats where I plant the same number of trees and make sure that the trees are equivalent to each other, and there are several of these habitats. Now, what I will do is I'll randomly assign these habitats to my conditions. Some habitats will be control groups where no erosion no deforestation will take place. Other habitats, 25% of the trees will be cut down. Other habitats, 50% of the trees will be cut down, and then other habitats, 75% of the trees will be cut down. And I could even have one with all the habitats being cut down as well. So that talks about how I'm going to be changing the variables. Think about a way now about how you keep other things constant. So you can think about if I did this within an experimental lab, like a greenhouse, I could make sure that the steepness of the soil is equivalent for all the habitats. I could also make sure that the rain, or in other words, how much the water falls on the plants is equivalent. I could also make sure that the wind generated by fans is equivalent. I could also make sure that the types of plants used are all the same. So these are all things which I'm going to be doing. Control versus experimental groups. I already talked about it, but make sure that you have that clear in your mind that you're going to have a group that does not have trees cut down, and then there's several groups where you cut more and more trees. And remember that you're going to randomly assort your habitats to those conditions. Then you describe how you're going to measure the dependent variable. Now I'm going to have to measure erosion. There's several ways you could do it. I could get a stick and I can measure these random samples throughout the habitats and see how much the soil has gone down after the erosion events took place. Or I could have all of this set up also sort of like an incline, and then have at the end of the incline some bags or bins to capture the sand that's been falling off, and then weigh the amount of sand, let the water through, just filtrate it, capture just the sand, and weigh the amount of sand, and then the environment where more sand is moved will be the one that had more erosion, basically, so that you could do that. Safety. You have to talk about some things that could be dangerous. You could cause landslides within the habitat. You're going to be playing with fans and things to cut down trees and all kinds of stuff. So you got to make sure to include those things. Then you also have to have steps to increase validity, and for that you have to look at reliability, precision, and accuracy. You can never be sure of accuracy, although if you do everything right, you're probably going to do this. But one of the things you could do is to make sure that the tools that you use to manipulate the variables and measure the variables are all calibrated. So the amount of wind, the amount of water, the machine that you use for that, that the trees are equivalent in height, that the trees have the same amount of roots pretty much, that they're the same kind of tree on average. That you can kind of estimate that the bins are set up correctly to capture all the sand and make sure that you use the most precise scale possible. Then you can also think about representation. Make sure you randomly assign the habitats to each conditions, and you have more than one habitat per condition, so you have replication, you have repetition, so that you can get the average amount of erosion per condition instead of just measuring each condition once, and the average will give you more power and it will be a better experiment. So you see how I make sure that repetition was part of it, make sure precision was part of it, and all that stuff. That is how you write a good experiment, and you make sure you address all of this. Now all you have to do is write a paragraph or an outline format description of exactly what you're going to do, where after you're done you can go back and make sure that in your outline you did exactly that, and that you have nothing out, including how you're going to cut down the trees. Every single thing you're going to do you explained, but that you made sure that these criteria were all included there. and you're going to be fine with the experiment design. After that, of course, it's all about collecting that data, and there's some things you can do. First of all, you can check for the precision of the data. One way that you could do that is if you notice that you have 3 habitats assigned to the condition of the control group, but the amount of erosion was very different. That means your data is not reliable. If groups in the same condition are experiencing very vastly amounts of different data, the reliability in your experiment is very low. So for example, let's say that you have one group where you have 80 tons of erosion, another group you have 40 tons of erosion, another group you have 60 tons of erosion, but these are all control groups. You shouldn't have seen so much difference between the groups because they're all in the same condition. That tells you that something went wrong. There was an error in your experiment. It could be experimental, human, chance error. Something happened that messed up your experiment. So looking at the data itself will give you an indication of if you have reliability or not. If you measure the same thing many times and the numbers are not close, not consistent, you don't have reliability. Also about precision, you can also make sure that the data was precisely measured when it was being measured by having more than one person double check the way the data is being measured. So it's always good to check the data as much as possible before you actually analyze the data. But when it comes to analyzing the data, let's say you actually put this data on a graph and you find that the control group had this much erosion on average. And of course, when you establish a graph, you're going to make sure you do everything right. So use dry mix. And remember that dry mix stands for the dependent variable, which is the responding variable goes on the y-axis. So on the y-axis, I will put the erosion. And then on the x-axis, I will put the independent variable, which in this case was the deforestation. Now, I could also make sure that I include units on both. I can put the control group, which is 0% deforestation. I can have 25% deforestation, 50%, 75%, and then 100%. And then I can actually have the units here as well, which is going to be tons. So notice that I am labeling both axes and putting units for both axes, numbers, and everything is in scale. And then I put a title here. I can put the effect of deforestation on erosion. Now I have a completed graph. Then I put the bars to represent. Maybe on the control group I had this much erosion. And then on the 25% I had a little more. On the 50% I had a little more. And then the 75% I had a little more. And then on the 100%. So whatever the result may be, you notice that you're going to have this increasing pattern of erosion across the groups. And what that tells you is that your hypothesis was probably, failed to be rejected. But remember, you still have to do statistics to make sure that this is the case. And if you were doing a real experiment, you would do that. Now you would start your conclusion with a statement saying, for example, the results fail to reject the hypothesis that the cutting down trees would increase the erosion. And then you interpret the results by saying that that's the case because the more trees that were cut down, the more likely the wind and rain were to carry the topsoil off. And this is comparable to the research that was found by other experiments. See how I'm going through the steps there. Other researchers found similar results in this and this and this experiment. And you can mention the articles where they are saying, and then you can say that it's probably happened because the roots of the trees hold the topsoil in place. When you cut the roots out, the more erosion would increase. But you can also say that it's possible that some of the runoff, to address limitations and discuss them and all of that, it's possible that some of the runoff was not collected by the bags or the bins, so it would be better to use some sort of grate system in the future. And also, this experiment was designed to be done in a lab, which does not necessarily mimic the natural conditions, and it might not be generalizable for the real life, so it's important to try to replicate this using equivalent habitats in the future. So see how I talked about two limitations, and then I addressed both those limitations and suggested how to fix them in the future. You can talk about applications. For example, you can say that farmers, if they want to maintain their topsoils, they should refrain from leaving soil that does not have natural vegetation or some vegetation on it. And then also a future research could explore the different types of soil, the plants, varying types of amounts of wind and rain as other effects that also lead to erosion. After that, you would share what you found out. You discuss that with your colleagues through networking. You would publish in journals, go to agricultural presentations. You present at geological conferences, talk about this on TV and radio. You replicate and expand this research together with other people. And then, after enough data was collected about this and other hypotheses about erosion, you could develop what is called the theory of erosion, which encompasses many facts about erosion, including all the factors that could possibly cause it, not just deforestation. This theory may even include some statements that seem to be universally true and almost invariably applicable to every single situation, which would be called the laws of erosion. But you always keep in your mind that it's possible that this law would have to be changed with new evidence that could be presented. So you see, the scientific method can be easy to apply when you know exactly how to do it. And we talked about several examples as we did in the lecture series. We talked about the aggression in children. We talked about the video game example when we were talking about the experiments. But you could also use this in real life. For example, let's try to say you find out what's the best recipe for a cake or something like that. What you can do is you can keep everything the same and change one ingredient, one little bit of it, and see what happens. And compare that with several other groups where you change several other things. And that way you find out what's the best thing. And you also obviously have a control group where you don't change anything, so you can have a comparison. You hold everything else constant except for the ingredient that you're changing. All of these things can be used in real life. And that's how a great way to solve problems. When you want to try to find out the source of a problem, try to change one thing at a time until you find what exactly is what's causing the problem. That's the scientific method. I hope you understand it and is able to apply it in class.